So this video is a bit different than my usual stuff. Heck, it's actually going to touch on things that I actively avoid talking about here on the channel. However, I think it's about time I actually throw this out there, if only because I've been meaning to do it for a long time, and I think that some of you might be interested in what I have to say about it. If you're a member of my Discord server, you've probably heard me say at some point or another, D&D players are selfish. Not only do I say that quite often, but it's also become a bit of a catchphrase there as well. However, what do I actually mean when I say this? Well, if there's one thing that I am saying, it's not some deep philosophical proclamation against the nature of human beings. I mean, people could just be selfish for a lot of reasons, both within the confines of D&D and outside of it. For players, they could just beg and whine for more gold, more healing, more magic items, more stats, more roleplay, more combat. That's not what I'm getting at. When I say D&D players are selfish, I'm actually referring to a common mentality that a lot of D&D players tend to have. What is this mentality? Well, first off, let's just really quickly define what D&D actually is. D&D, with regard to the product that we've been provided, is a combat-focused tabletop role-playing game. In that, the keywords being stated in there are combat-focused. So whenever you're creating your character, most of our concerns with this revolve around their capabilities during combat. Sure, it's possible to make a highly specific character with almost no combat relevance whatsoever, but from the books that were provided, that's not what we're really encouraged to do. For cripe's sake, one of the 3 core rulebooks is full of nothing but dangerous monsters intended to kill us. So regarding how you actually play D&D at your table, the core of the game is intended to actually be combat focused. So what about it then? Well, when we create our characters, we often strive to create the most powerful character that we can, or at least a competent enough one that can still actually play the game. After all, we want to properly prepare ourselves for whatever the Dungeon Master is actually going to throw at us. And it'd be a real big shame if we just got suddenly annihilated anticlimactically. Still, even that is not actually what I'm referring to as a selfish D&D player. After all, there is nothing wrong with creating a powerful character in D&D. No, my main issue, and why I actually say D&D players are selfish, is with how some players approach character creation and conduct themselves over the course of play. Take this for example. Do you happen to know what the best class in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is right now? Maybe you do. After all, it's a pretty contentious subject to speak of in and of itself, especially since there's a huge number of possible considerations for us to take account of. Some of you may say that the Paladin is the best class, largely because of its hit points, defenses, divine smite, spells casting, and its use of charisma. Some of you might even say that the Bard is the best because of its exceptional coverage of all gameplay aspects. Me? I mean, I think the Rogue is pretty great too. It's certainly not the best, but it's a hot contender to be one of the best. And in some far-off corner of the internet, I've also heard that Artificers are just obscenely broken. There are all sorts of arguments that we can raise in this instance. But that's not the important thing here either. The important thing is that there isn't just a best class. Everyone plays whatever they want for whatever reasons they value the most. And that's a great thing for the game. If anything, this behavior completely flies in the face of what I say about D&D players being selfish, right? Well, yes, and also no. You see, it actually doesn't have anything to do with what character you play during D&D. It mainly has to do with how you're playing it. Let's just go down the list, shall we? Artificers gain infusions, allowing them to augment equipment and replicate magic items. Did you know that these infusions can actually be shared with other party members? Maybe not, because a lot of Artificers aren't at all keen on sharing them. Barbarians sure do love to rage and run headlong into battle, but when they do so, they aren't really concerned with anything other than their own damage output and their own personal survival, let alone their teammates. Bards can sometimes just hoard their bardic inspiration and inspire nobody other than themselves. Clerics are always just encouraged by other players to just babysit them. Druids just like to wild shape and then run headlong into combat and completely forget about the rest of the party. Fighters just fight for the top DPS. Monks struggle to contribute much of anything aside from Stunning Strike. Paladins just empty their spell slots into nothing but divine smites, despite having actual spells. Rangers constantly fight for the spotlight. Rogues just throw temper tantrums every time you don't let them use their sneak attack. Sorcerers just spam Fireball. Warlocks spam Eldritch Blast. And wizards, much like sorcerers, spam Fireball. You know what? Sometimes this is necessary, but if you think this is the expected way you're supposed to play D&D, and that this is normal, you need to take a bit of a deep breath, step aside, and reconsider your options for a moment. Let's use this as an example. Any of you remember when Tasha's Cauldron of Everything came out and everybody was just losing their minds over the Twilight Domain Cleric? I mean, 300 feet of dark vision, advantage on initiative rolls, an AoE regenerating shield, flight, and passive half cover generation. It's all really good, right? Yeah, it absolutely is. In fact, it's so good, it's actually a problem at some of the tables. But that's actually not my point. Did any of you actually read the Peace Domain Cleric? You know, the other new cleric subclass presented in the same book right next to the Twilight Domain? The Peace Cleric can bolster an entire party that just stands roughly together. It can also rush freely to an ally's side to heal them, enables allies to teleport to each other's sides, and even allows them to take hits for one another with damage resistance to all damage types. Sounds pretty good, right? I mean, you could argue it's still not as good as the Twilight Domain Cleric, but that's not why nobody actually talks about it. No, the reason why nobody talks about it is because the Peace Domain Cleric is a selfless cleric subclass. It requires you, and encourages your allies, to be willing to step in to take hits for one another in order to best mitigate damage. So when comparing that to the Twilight Domain's passive generating shield, regardless of any possible considerations of how much damage you're actually mitigating with it, everybody just looked at it and went, I don't want to take damage for somebody else, forget that. And that's the exact kind of thing I'm thinking about when I'm saying D&D players are selfish. For a lesser example, consider the implications of casting the spell Bane versus Bless. Essentially, they are near identical spells to one another, with one debuffing the enemies while the other one buffs your allies. However, there is one key difference between these spells beyond just their ideal applications. And that's the fact that Bane has the chance to actually fail, and Bless will just always work. So then, why would anybody ever choose to cast Bane over Bless then? Especially outside of its ideal application? Well, just think about it. What are you actually saying when you cast these spells? With Bless, you're saying, I'm making all of us better. With Bane, you're saying, I am making them worse. Yes, Bane imparts benefits to your allies still, but they are indirect, and the focus of the spell still remains entirely on you. With Bless, you still remain the center of attention, but you're also sharing the benefits of that spell with everybody else around you. With Bane, you're not sharing any of that attention. It's a far more egocentric spell. And coupled with the fact that it can actually fail when you cast it, it can make you look really bad by comparison, especially if you did have access to cast Bless instead. Again, this is a lesser example of selfish play, since each spell warrants a different application on a technical level. But you can still see what I'm getting at, right? How about we go for a way more extreme example? Remember the original playable Kobold race in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes? It was considered to be a very powerful race. After all, Pack Tactics grant you advantage on all of your attack rolls made while an ally's within 5 feet of your target? That sounds almost too good to pass up, right? Well, here's the thing. What was Pack Tactics actually supposed to emulate for the game? Heck, where did the feature even come from? Well, that's an actually easy answer. It came from the Monsters Manual. And guess why Monsters had this feature? Because monsters with Pack Tactics are supposed to be paired up with other monsters that have the same feature, or at the very least, abilities that are still meant to complement it. This was done to create synergy amongst the monsters and emulate teamwork as a game mechanic. Did this actually translate over to the playable Kobold in any way? No, of course not. Not only did it not promote teamwork, it did the complete opposite of that. It promoted ally exploitation. Yes, you weren't just engaging enemies for the benefit of your allies, you were engaging them because you wanted the benefit for yourself. Not only that, it got even worse when people realized that the Kobold didn't even need to stand next to its target in order to gain their advantage. They just needed an ally to be there instead. And so they then started to hang out in the back and ask their allies to go throw themselves into danger for their own personal benefit. Simply put, that is not teamwork. This is selfishness, plain and simple. So, since Pack Tactics was a bit of a problematic feature, what did Wizards of the Coast do? They removed it from the Kobold and gave them Draconic Cry instead, which is actually just an improved version of Grovel, Cower, and Beg, but one that grants them and their allies advantage against all creatures within 10 feet of them as a bonus action. In many ways, this is a lot like Pack Tactics, but with the actual benefit encouraging you to lend help to your allies. So what do people actually think about it? Well, a lot of people think that it's complete garbage, so much so that the new Kobold is a completely unviable race to play. Okay, firstly, that's not true at all. Secondly, the new Kobold still gained other new features to its benefit, and even lost its sunlight sensitivity and negative ability score increase, both of which were just purely negative traits. Finally, if Pack Tactics was really the only thing you were looking at in the Kobold stat block, and thinking about just how useful that's just going to be for yourself, I'm sorry, that's just pure, unadulterated selfishness right there. I have always been glad that the Pack Tactics feature has been removed from the playable Kobold, and it has absolutely nothing to do with how good it was. I am simply happy that it's gone because now it can no longer enthrall players into acting degenerately at the table. Okay, so I've been pretty harsh on a few subjects right now, and I hope that nobody's listening to this is feeling particularly called out by it either. So I'll rein it in a little bit and just talk about something that I myself am personally guilty of. Eldritch Blast. I mean, you all know I love Warlocks and Eldritch Blast, right? And those of us that do, we all love Agonizing Blast, right? Well, what about Repelling Blast and Grasp of Hadar? Sure, you usually don't take both of these invocations together, but even just having access to one of them isn't just a benefit for yourself. It allows you to separate enemies from your allies, especially at higher levels when you're able to cast the beam multiple times. Over the course of my time playing as Davrian Luceren, I made almost no use of these invocations to actually help my allies. That was largely because my life was almost constantly in danger, but that's besides the point. Both of those features have genuine real applicational value to extend beyond just I'm moving the enemy to where I want it to be. Honestly, especially considering how many times during that campaign both me and my allies brushed with death, we probably would have fared a lot better together if we'd actually coordinated as a team. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to get out of all this. Teamwork. Yes, some classes are inherently more selfish than others with how they function. Heck, sometimes the entire value of a class or character is just to kill enemies fast enough that they can't do any real harm to anybody else. But that shouldn't undermine anything that has a value for teamwork. D&D might be a combat-focused tabletop role-playing game, but it's also balanced around being a team-based game. Literally, the game genuinely expects you to be in a group of 4 people. I'm sure lots of us can agree that's usually best for each player to have their own specialized niche, allowing them to excel where others will suffer. However, you don't have to tackle all of the tasks that you have on your own, and combat doesn't have to be some chaotic competition about who could score the most kills or deal the most damage. One piece of advice that I give to every new player whenever they're starting out in D&D is to play a character who's there to help and support everyone around them. This isn't done out of belittlement. I'm not telling them to do this because they can't be trusted to do anything else. I do this because it sets up good gaming habits for them and shows them how no reasonable person is likely to ever complain about them if all they're trying to do is be an ally that can always be counted on. So maybe next time when you're going to go play your D&D session, try and keep yourself open-minded about the other people that are sitting at the table with you. I think you'd find it very unlikely that anyone would ever stick their nose up at you if you ever do anything that looks out for them. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening, and take care.